Good morning and welcome to Rising. We've got another terrific show for you today. Welcome back, Briahna. Nice to see you.
It's good to be here. There is an action-packed show. Do stick around for all of it. I've got a radar coming up later today. But first, Robby, what's new in the news?
All right. Well, in response to continued anti-war college protests at over 150 different campuses, the centrist political group No Labels is reportedly urging Congress to further crack down on student protests. Now, The Intercept has reported that No Labels is hosting Democratic Representative Josh Gottheimer and Republican Representative Mike Lawler at an event with about 300 attendees, including trustees from several universities, about how to get the FBI more involved. Now, I can't speak for the local FBI field offices, said Gottheimer, but it's gotta be all hands on deck. The two congressmen praised universities who have relied on police forces to quash protesters, promised that Congress would do more to investigate student movements. Gottheimer reportedly told the room, based on my conversations with the FBI, there's activity I can't get into, given my committee responsibilities. I can't get into more specifics, but I can just say that I think people are well aware this is an issue. Gottheimer is on the House Intelligence Committee. Now, this comes after House Republicans said they would push to withhold federal funding for universities that held campus protests, and after Lawler co-sponsored the Columbia Act with Representative Richie Torres, which would station anti-Semitism monitors on college campuses receiving federal funding.
While the No Labels reps are looking to increase FBI scrutiny of college students, Columbia University professor Rebecca Weiner is under scrutiny for her role in the crackdown on campus. The Gray Zone reported that the professor also serves as intelligence director for the NYPD, and Mayor Adams has credited her with spying on anti-genocide student protesters and directing last week's militarized raid. Weiner's titles include civilian executive in charge of the New York City Police Department's Intelligence and Counterterrorism Bureau. In that role, she reportedly develops policy and strategic priorities for the Intelligence and Counterterrorism Bureau, raising questions about conflicts of interest with her role serving the speech and educational needs of Columbia students. Harvard University issued a warning to students participating in the pro-Palestine encampments at Harvard Yard, saying that they could face involuntary leave and potentially be barred from taking finals and banned from campus housing. According to the Harvard Crimson, University interim president Alan Garber had remained mum in the last 2 weeks since the protests sprouted there, but he escalated his approach Monday, threatening disciplinary actions if protesters didn't dismantle their occupation by 5 p.m. that afternoon. At 7 p.m. Monday evening, protesters marched from the Johnston Gate to Garber's private residence, chanting, "We will not stop, we will not rest." Meanwhile, students at MIT were also met with the possibility of facing disciplinary action over their encampment. Their deadline was 2:30 p.m. Monday, and like students at Harvard, they missed it. According to reports, protesters clashed with police, but that was quickly dispersed, and while most left, they tore down a fence that had been put around the encampment. Over 100 high school students from Boston staged a walkout and made their way to MIT to stand in solidarity with the pro-Palestine demonstration there. So it does seem like, despite there being a real escalation in the amount of police force that's being used to quash these protests, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later in the show in a segment about Biden's increased funding drive for the police, the students don't seem to have responded to that by disbanding the encampments or stopping their protests. In fact, they seem to continue to be growing. In the case of Boston, several high schools, including Cambridge Orange and Latin, one of the oldest, I think maybe the oldest school in the country, staging a walkout to walk down Mass Ave and join the MIT students who are protesting there. And then we're seeing this escalation happening, not just in terms of the number of the police and the police being sent in, but a kind of real mask off moment when you're realizing that there are people who are embedded in some of these campuses, like Professor Weiner, who have concrete roles, intelligence roles, both with the NYPD and as a liaison to Tel Aviv. I mean, does this raise concerns about kind of sprawling surveillance powers? And yes, the conflict of interest between the role of professors, the role of protecting speech rights and freedom of assembly on college campuses, and what feels like a creeping intelligence apparatus.
Yeah, look, I think it's actually very simple how to handle these encampments from the university's perspective. I don't think they need to get more outside police involved, because that's creating the clashes and the videos we're seeing that make no one happy and are often far too brutal and are actually making a situation where there is making concerning situations dangerous situations. if these students are violating policies of the universities, if the encampments have overstayed their welcome and are now disruptive to other people being able to use the campus, then they can face disciplinary measures, including suspension and expulsion. As several of the presidents have said, if you're still, camped out past a certain time, that will be the consequence. That seems like the obvious and straightforward way to sort this out without having to, have the protesters or have the police or counter-protesters tearing down encampments and fighting with the students. Frankly, that's not fair to the police, because then it makes them look bad when they start yanking people around or bashing people around in some of these videos. So I would just say the universities can handle it. The universities can say, you can't do this if it's violating a campus policy, and here's the punishment.
What's been really remarkable is to see how differently this plays out on college campuses, where the administration has been willing just to sit down and talk to students about their demands. Remember, at many of these campuses, there have been votes of students and faculty on the fundamental question here, which is whether or not the universities will divest from weapons manufacturing, generally speaking, but particularly weapons manufacturing that is being used in the siege in Gaza, and also other kind of business entities in the occupied West Bank. And when there is a willingness to listen to what these votes are telling the administrators, the students and faculty want to happen, and simply divest, even if the divestment hasn't happened, even the conversations, it seems, rightly or wrongly, have been enough to tamp down the demonstrations and cause students to disband at certain universities across the country. And this does feel a little bit like what are those games you played as a kid? Like we call them those finger traps, where the more you pull, the more your fingers are stuck. That does seem to be what universities like Columbia are finding themselves in the position of. And that raises some really interesting questions of why is Columbia's investment, its literal investments in Israel, more important than the well-being of their student and faculty who seemed very aligned on this issue? Why are they more willing to cancel graduation than to simply divest their billion-dollar endowments, in many cases, multi-billion-dollar endowments, in this one country? Why is this seen as a zero-sum game where there can be absolutely no compromising on a pretty legitimate question that students and faculty are raising, which is why are our tuition dollars going to fund a country and invest in a country and invest in businesses that are part and parcel of one of the worst humanitarian crises we've seen in our lives?
Canceling graduation really is a shame for those students. The class of 2024 was also the high school class of 2020, having their graduations then interrupted by the pandemic. I think it is not good how easily educational institutions now think they'll just shut down. Exaggerating danger, exaggerating inconvenience. It's not just like snow days anymore. It's for any little reason, often at K through 12 environments. That's happening more and more. This seemed like a pretty needless escalation on the administration's part, maybe to make the protesters, or try to blame the protesters and make them more unpopular among the campus body or among the other students.
I mean, the thing is, at least the attitude on campus doesn't seem to be to make the protests more unpopular.
Well, maybe not on campuses, I think, but that's America-wide.
Well, that's what matters. It's been the case in every protest movement historically, from the civil rights to Vietnam on up, that if you poll public opinion, they think that the protesters are wrong. And then 20 or 30 years goes by, and people are deeply ashamed to have been on the other side of the protesters who understood at the time the students have never been proven wrong, whether it is about the futility of our engagement in Vietnam, whether it is about whether or not black people and white people should be treated equally under the law in the United States of America, whether or not it's about South African racial apartheid there. So, the real question is whether or not the internal, remember, many of these are private universities, whether or not the private leadership of a private university is willing to basically tank the educational institution, disallow large numbers of their own graduating class not to graduate. In the case of the UC school, disallowing a Muslim valedictorian from giving a valedictorian speech, undermining itself repeatedly again and again and again, all because it is fundamentally unwilling to simply divest financially from Israel.
All right, we'll have more Rising right after this.